The emerald silk of my gown felt less like a celebration and more like a shroud as I stood in the center of the gilded ballroom of the Zenith Heights, overlooking the fog-drenched skyline of San Francisco. For 30 years I had been the silent architect of a life that everyone envied, yet, as my husband Julian Thorne stepped toward the mahogany podium, his eyes glittering with a predatory sort of triumph, I realized that the foundation of our entire existence was about to crumble in front of 500 of the city's elite. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the cloying sweetness of vintage champagne, but all I could taste was the metallic tang of a long-suppressed fear. Julian adjusted his silk tie with a sharp, familiar motion that usually preceded a hostile corporate takeover, and as he gripped the microphone, the silence that fell over the audience was not one of respect, but of bated breath, as if they could sense the impending slaughter of my dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice boomed, amplified to a thunderous resonance that seemed to shake the very crystal of the chandeliers above us. We are here to celebrate 3 decades of what many call a perfect union, a partnership built on the bedrock of Thorne Industries and the unwavering stability of our home. I looked toward our children, Leo and Maya, who sat at the front table, their faces masks of practiced composure, and I wondered if they saw the cracks in the porcelain. Julian turned his gaze toward me, a thin, patronizing smile curling his lips as he continued his narrative. You see, a successful man is like a master builder, but even the best builder needs a place to store his tools and a quiet room to rest. Let's be honest for a moment, he said, and a few scattered uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd as his tone shifted into something dangerously casual. I made the millions. I transformed a small design firm into a global titan. I provided the mansions, the jets, and the status. Elena, well, she was the curator of the domestic. She managed the menus and the nursery. She is lucky I kept her around all these years, because without this throne I built, she would be nothing more than a ghost in a faded dress. The hum of the crowd turned into a sickening, hushed roar of pity that burned against my skin like acid. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands trembling so violently that I had to clench them into fists against the fabric of my dress. This was the man I had sacrificed my own promising career for, the man whose late-night brainstorms were fueled by my sketches and whose greatest successes were built on the blueprints I had quietly refined while he slept. Just as I felt the world begin to tilt, a shadow detached itself from the back of the room. A man moved toward the stage with a fluid, terrifying grace that commanded the attention of every guest in the room. He did not ask for permission. He walked straight up to Julian, his presence so massive and overwhelming that my husband actually recoiled. This was Caleb Sterling, the reclusive billionaire whose technology had revolutionized urban infrastructure and the owner of the very hotel where we stood. He snatched the microphone from Julian's hand with a flick of his wrist, his dark eyes burning with a cold, focused fury. She isn't lucky, Caleb's voice rang out, devoid of the need for theatrics, but laden with an authority that made the room go absolutely still. She is the one who got away, and I have spent exactly 30 years waiting for you to prove how little you deserved her. Julian's face went from a flush of arrogance to a ghostly, mottled gray as he blinked in confusion, his mouth opening and closing like a fish caught on a hook. I stared at Caleb, and for a moment the 30 years of my marriage evaporated. I was 21 again, standing in the rain outside the Rhode Island School of Design, looking into the eyes of a brilliant, penniless student who had promised to help me build cities of light. I had chosen Julian because he was safe, because he was established, and because I had been terrified of the fire that Caleb carried in his soul. Now that fire was standing on a stage in San Francisco, threatening to burn down the lie of my life. Caleb turned his gaze away from Julian and looked directly at me, and in that look I saw everything I had lost. He didn't see the socialite or the wife, he saw the girl who could draw the future on a napkin. "You are not a ghost, Elena," he said softly, yet his words carried to every corner of the ballroom. "You are the architect. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on Julian as he stood there stripped of his power in front of his peers, while I realized that the cage door had finally been kicked open. For 30 years I had convinced myself that my invisibility was a small price to pay for my children's security. But as I looked at Maya's shocked face and Leo's downward gaze, I understood that I hadn't been protecting them. I had been teaching them that love was a transaction where the woman always went bankrupt. Julian tried to regain his footing, his voice cracking as he reached for the mic. "Who do you think you are, Sterling? This is a private party?" Caleb didn't even look back at him. "I am the man who remembers the Aura Project, Julian. I am the man who knows that the modular living systems that made Thorn Industries a household name didn't come from your mind. They came from the woman you just tried to bury." A collective gasp went through the room, a sound like a sudden intake of air before a storm. I felt a strange, soaring sensation in my chest, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Julian had stolen my sketches from our senior year, the ones I had tucked away when I found out I was pregnant with Leo. He had patented them under his own name while I was in the hospital, telling me it was for the good of our new family. I had spent 3 decades pretending I didn't know. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, yet my heart beating with a rhythm I hadn't felt in a lifetime. I didn't look at the guests. I didn't look at the cameras. I walked toward the stage, each step echoing in the hollow silence of the grand ballroom. Julian watched me approach, his eyes pleading for me to play the part, one last time to smile and laugh it off as a joke. But the mask was broken, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces that could never be glued back together. I reached the edge of the stage and Caleb reached down, offering me his hand. Behind me, Julian's voice was a panicked whisper, a desperate attempt to exert the control he no longer possessed. "Elena, sit down. You are making a scene. You are ruining everything we worked for." I ignored him, my fingers brushing against Caleb's palm. His grip was steady and warm, a stark contrast to the cold, distant touch I had grown accustomed to. I climbed onto the stage, turning to face the sea of faces that represented my social prison. I looked at the women I had chaired committees with, the men who had ignored my ideas at dinner parties, and the children who only saw me as a provider of comfort. The moral weight of 30 years of silence pressed against my throat, but when I spoke my voice was as clear as a bell in the winter air. "Julian is right about one thing," I said, and the room seemed to lean in. "We did build an empire, but a throne built on someone else's dreams is just a very expensive cage." I looked at Julian, seeing him for the first time, not as the giant I had feared, but as a small, hollow man who had spent his life decorating a vacuum. "I am done polishing your crown, Julian. I am going to go build something of my own now." As I walked off that stage with Caleb, leaving my husband standing in the ruins of his own celebration, the cool night air of the city hit me like a benediction. We walked through the private corridors of the hotel, away from the whispers and the flashing lights, until we reached a secluded balcony that hung over the bay. The fog was rolling in thick and white, obscuring the world below, leaving us in a private island of stone and sky. I leaned against the railing, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the reality of what I had just done crashing over me. I had walked away from a billion-dollar fortune, a social standing I had spent my life cultivating, and a marriage that defined my very identity. "Are you okay?" Caleb asked, standing a respectful distance away, his jacket draped over his arm. I laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that surprised even me. "I don't think I've been okay since 1996, Caleb. I don't think I've known who I was for half my life." He moved closer, the scent of cedar and rain clinging to him. "You were always there, Elena. I watched your career from afar, or rather the lack of it. I saw your husband's company grow, and I recognized every curve, every innovative use of light, every signature move you made in your sketches when we were kids. It killed me to see him take the credit while you stayed in the shadows. Why did you do it? Why did you stay? I closed my eyes, picturing the house in Presidio Heights, the perfect gardens, the way Julian would bring me flowers after every major deal he closed on my ideas. Because I thought that was what a good woman did, I whispered. I thought that if I was the bridge he walked across to reach greatness, then I was part of that greatness. I didn't realize until tonight that he wasn't walking across the bridge. He was dismantling it to build his walls. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper, the edges yellowed with time. He unfolded it with trembling fingers and handed it to me. It was a sketch of a lighthouse drawn in charcoal with a series of intricate interlocking gears at the base. It was my design for a kinetic sculpture we had dreamt of building together during our junior year. I kept it, Caleb said. I kept every letter you ever wrote me, every drawing you left in the library, every piece of your mind that you gave away. I built Sterling Tech because I wanted to create a world where someone like you wouldn't have to choose between a family and a soul. I looked at the drawing, a relic of a girl who believed she could harness the wind. I didn't just leave him tonight, Caleb. I don't know where I'm going. He looked out over the bay, his profile sharp against the city lights. You're going back to the beginning, Elena. And this time you won't be alone. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles and social earthquakes. Julian didn't go quietly. He moved to freeze our joint accounts, claimed I was having a nervous breakdown, and even tried to turn Leo and Maya against me by telling them I was having an affair with Caleb. He launched a smear campaign in the press painting me as a disgruntled wife who was trying to extort him for a legacy I hadn't earned. I moved into a small, light-filled studio in the Mission District, a space Caleb helped me find, but one I insisted on paying for with the small inheritance my mother had left me. It was sparse with white walls and drafting tables, and for the first time in 30 years there was no Julian Thorne to tell me that my ideas were too expensive or impractical. The confrontation with my children was the hardest part. Leo came to the studio first, his face tight with a resentment I knew all too well. It was the same look Julian gave me when I questioned his business decisions. "Mom, how could you do this?" He was pacing the small room, his expensive shoes clicking on the hardwood. "Dad is a wreck. The board is talking about removing him. You're destroying everything we have for some old grudge." I sat him down, handing him a portfolio of original sketches dated years before he was born. "These aren't grudges, Leo. These are your inheritance. Your father didn't build Thorne Industries. He managed my talent. I need you to understand that a life built on a lie is a debt that eventually comes due." Leo looked at the sketches, his eyes widening as he recognized the iconic shapes of the buildings and products that had funded his private schools and exotic vacations. He didn't say anything for a long time, but as he left, he didn't call his father. He just touched my shoulder, a small, tentative gesture of recognition. Maya was different. She came to the studio and sat on the floor watching me draw for hours. She didn't ask about the money or the scandal. She asked about the light. "Why do you always put the windows there, Mom?" she asked, pointing to a sketch of a sustainable housing complex I was designing. "Because everyone deserves to see the sun," I told her. "Even when they're trapped inside." Maya looked at me, her eyes bright with a new kind of respect. "I never knew you were a person, Mom. I thought you were just—" The house that broke my heart more than Julian's insults ever could. I had become an architectural feature in my own family, a part of the scenery that they expected to be there, unchanging and silent. Julian's final play was a legal injunction to stop me from using any design concepts that he claimed were trade secrets of Thorne Industries. He sued me for intellectual property theft, a move so audacious it actually made me admire his ruthlessness for a fleeting second. He wanted to ensure that even if I left him, I could never work again. We ended up in a sterile courtroom in downtown San Francisco. the air smelling of floor wax and old paper. Julian sat across from me, his lawyers flanking him like a pack of wolves. He looked older, the arrogance replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. The judge, a formidable woman named Evelyn Vance, looked over the documents with a skeptical eye. "Mr. Thorne," she said, peering over her spectacles, "you are claiming that your wife stole her own ideas from you." Julian stood up, his voice tight. "Your Honor, those designs were developed during the course of our marriage using company resources. They are the property of Thorne Industries." I stood up then without waiting for my lawyer to prompt me. I didn't have a team of wolves. I just had a folder of hand-drawn sketches. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, despite the thundering of my heart, "I didn't use company resources. I used a kitchen table and a pencil while I was waiting for the laundry to dry. I didn't steal from Thorne Industries. I gave them 30 years of my life for free, but I didn't give them my future." I walked to the judge's bench and laid out a series of drawings. On the left were the patents Julian had filed over the years. On the right were my original sketches, dated and signed, by me hidden in the back of my old RISD portfolio that Caleb had returned to me. The dates on my sketches preceded his patents by months, sometimes years. I also produced a diary I had kept documenting the nights Julian had asked me to look over his notes, the hours I had spent redrawing his clumsy attempts at innovation. The courtroom was silent as Judge Vance flipped through the pages. She looked at Julian, her expression one of cold, professional disdain. "Mr. Thorne, it appears your entire empire is built on a foundation of plagiarism." The ruling was a landslide. Not only was the injunction denied, but the judge ordered a full audit of Thorne Industries' intellectual property. The scandal was catastrophic for Julian. The board of directors ousted him within 48 hours, and the company's stock plummeted. He was left with the mansions and the jets, but the one thing he valued most, his reputation as a visionary, was gone. He had become a footnote in his own story, a man who had polished a throne that belonged to someone else. A few months later, I stood at the opening of the Sterling Vance Design Center. It was a building I had designed myself, a structure of glass and recycled steel that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the city. Caleb stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. We weren't a tabloid headline. We were partners in every sense of the word. I looked out at the crowd, seeing Leo and Maya standing in the front row, looking at the building with a pride that wasn't tied to a price tag. I realized then that the greatest lesson I had learned wasn't about design or architecture. It was about the cost of silence. We spend so much of our lives building walls to protect ourselves, convinced that if we just hide our true selves deep enough, we will be safe from the world's judgment. We trade our fire for security, our voices for harmony, and our dreams for a comfortable cage. But a life built on a lie is like a house built on sand. It might look magnificent in the sunlight, but the first storm will always reveal the truth. My 30 years with Julian wasn't a total loss. It was the long, painful education I needed to understand that my worth wasn't something he gave me. It was something I had all along tucked away in a drawer, waiting for me to be brave enough to pick up the pencil and draw my own way out. Humanity's greatest tragedy is not the failures we endure, but the lives we never live, because we are afraid to disappoint the people who only love the version of us that serves them. As I watched the sun set over the Golden Gate Bridge from the balcony of my new life, I knew that I was no longer a ghost in a faded dress. I was the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in half a century, I was finally home. The moral of my story is a simple one, though it took me a lifetime to learn the most expensive thing you will ever own is the soul you sold for someone else's comfort. Reclaim it no matter how late the hour, because the view from the top of your own life is worth every bridge you had to burn to get there. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of the sea and the promise of a new dawn. Caleb handed me a glass of sparkling water, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the gallery lights. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past finally lift, leaving me light enough to fly. I was thinking about the lighthouse, I said. The one we dreamt of. He nodded, a knowing look passing between us. We're building it, Elena. Not just the sculpture. The life. And as the city lights twinkled like 1,000 fallen stars, I knew he was right. We weren't just building structures anymore. We were building a legacy of truth, one brick at a time, ensuring that the next generation of girls wouldn't have to wait 30 years to realize they were the masters of their own life. Julian Thorne died alone in a villa in France, a few years later, surrounded by the gold he had stolen and the ghosts of the family he had never truly known. I didn't feel hatred when I heard the news, only a profound, quiet sadness for the man who had the world at his feet, but never understood that the most valuable thing in it was standing right beside him. I sent a wreath of white lilies to his funeral, not out of love, but out of a final, graceful acknowledgement of the man who unwittingly pushed me into the fire so I could discover I was made of gold. My children and I are closer than we have ever been, a bond forged in the crucible of truth rather than the convenience of a lie. Maya is studying architecture now, her designs bold and unapologetic, and every time I see her at a drafting table, I see the girl I used to be finally free to breathe. The story of Elena Vance is not a story of a billionaire's rescue. It is a story of a woman's awakening. Caleb Sterling gave me a hand up, but I was the one who climbed out of the pit. He gave me a platform, but I was the one who spoke the truth. And in the end, that is the only kind of rescue that matters, the one where you save yourself. We walk through this world often feeling like extras in someone else's movie, but the moment you realize you are the writer, the director, and the star, the entire script changes. I looked at the sketch on my desk, a new design for a community center in a part of the city Julian would have never stepped foot in. I picked up my pencil, the familiar weight of it, a comfort I would never take for granted again. The first line I drew was straight and true, a path leading forward into a future that was entirely beautifully mine. I hope you realize as you listen to my words that your life is your own masterpiece. Don't let anyone else hold the brush. Don't let anyone else tell you which colors to use or where the shadows should fall. It is never too late to start over, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, and never too late to be the person you were meant to be before the world told you to be quiet. The silence of the ballroom that night was the end of a long, dark chapter, but the sound of my own voice was the beginning of a symphony. And as I stand here now in the light of my own creation, I can tell you with absolute certainty that the fire was worth the burn. The journey of self-discovery is often a lonely one, paved with the wreckage of our past expectations and the tears of those who prefer our old, compliant selves. But on the other side of that pain is a freedom so vast and so sweet that it defies description. I spent 30 years polishing a cage thinking it was a palace, and my only regret is that I didn't kick the door down sooner. But even that regret has faded into the background of a life that is now rich with meaning and purpose. I am no longer defined by the man I married or the children I raised. I am defined by the ideas I bring to life and the courage I show in the face of my own fears. As the years pass, the name Julian Thorne has faded from the headlines, replaced by the Sterling Vance legacy of innovation and integrity. Our buildings stand as monuments to the power of a woman's mind, and our company serves as a sanctuary for those whose talents have been overlooked or suppressed. We don't just build offices and hotels, we build opportunities for the silence to be heard. And every time a young woman walks through our doors with a portfolio full of dreams, I see myself in her eyes, and I promise her that her voice will never be stolen. The final human lesson I have to offer is this: your life is a gift, but your spirit is a responsibility. You owe it to yourself to protect that spirit, to nurture it, and to let it shine with all its brilliant, messy intensity. Don't wait for a Caleb Sterling to stand on a stage and defend you. Stand up for yourself. Don't wait for a courtroom to validate your worth. Validate yourself. The moment you decide that you are no longer willing to be a secondary character in your own existence, the world will have no choice but to adjust. The stars don't ask for permission to shine, and neither should you. I often go back to that balcony at the Zenith Heights, not to dwell on the pain of the past, but to remember the moment I chose to be free. The fog still rolls in, and the city still hums with the frantic energy of a million different stories, but I am no longer lost in the mist. I am a beacon, a lighthouse in my own right, standing tall against the wind and the rain. And to anyone who feels invisible, to anyone who feels like a ghost in their own home, I say this: look in the mirror and recognize the architect. The tools are in your hands and the blueprints are in your heart. It is time to start building. As the moonlight glints off the glass of the Sterling Vance Design Center, I reflect on the beauty of a life reclaimed. It is a messy, complicated, and sometimes terrifying process, but it is the only way to truly live. I have found a peace that Julian Thorne's millions could never buy, and a love with Caleb that is built on mutual respect and shared passion, rather than dependency and control. My children are thriving not because of their father's money, but because they have seen their mother find her strength. We are a family of individuals now bound by choice rather than obligation, and that is a far more powerful union than the one we had before. I sit at my desk, the city quiet around me, and I think of all the stories still waiting to be told, all the sketches still waiting to be drawn. My journey is far from over, but the most difficult part is behind me. I have crossed the bridge, and I have found that the other side is more beautiful than I ever imagined. The world is waiting for your light, your ideas, and your voice. Don't keep it waiting any longer. Be the one who got away from the life that was meant for someone else and walk into the life that was always meant for you. In the end, we are all just architects of our own experience. We choose the materials, we set the boundaries, and we decide how much light to let in. For 30 years I lived in a room with no windows, but today the walls are made of glass and the sun is everywhere. I am Elena Vance, and I am finally, undeniably free. The legacy I leave behind will not be measured in the height of the buildings I designed, but in the depth of the courage I found to stop being afraid, and that I believe is the greatest achievement of all. May you find the strength to look at your own life with honesty and the bravery to walk away from anything that asks you to be less than you are. The ballroom is empty, the guests have gone home, and the music has stopped, but my song is just beginning. And it is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I hope you find your song too, and that you sing it as loud as you can until the whole world knows your name. Because you are not a ghost, and you are certainly not lucky to be kept. You are a masterpiece in progress, and the world is waiting to see what you will create next.